Have you ever felt like you were written out of your own life, like you were cast in the background of a story you never agreed to? Maybe you were the quiet one, the forgotten sibling, the second choice, or the one who always stayed silent to keep the peace. This story isn't about revenge, it's about reclaiming authorship. And if you've ever wondered what it would look like to rewrite your ending instead of waiting for permission to be seen, this one was written for you. I was never supposed to be the main character. Not in their eyes, not in his, not even in mine. I was born into a story already being told, one where my name was written in the margins, penciled in faint gray, while Elira's was gilded in gold. From the beginning, I understood that our family had room for one light, and she burned brighter. I became a shadow out of necessity, a careful understudy, not unloved, just unnoticed. My mother once said I was the quiet one. She meant it as praise, but it landed like a verdict. I learned early that silence earned peace, and silence could be mistaken for grace. So I wore it like armor, quiet at the table, quiet in the halls, quiet even when my fingers bled behind the curtain of my first piano recital. Elira forgot her notes, cried on stage, and the audience cooed. I finished the entire piece backstage, unseen, hands trembling and stained red, while they gave her roses. That's the thing about stories, they only remember what they're told to. At 12, I won the regional spelling bee. Elira had placed second in a local singing contest, so they framed her certificate in the living room. Mine was folded and slipped beneath the remote tray. "We'll get to yours later," my father said, already turning the page of the newspaper. He didn't look up. I stopped bringing awards home after that. And yet the moment Elira crashed my mother's car at 17, drunk and shrieky, yelling at someone on speakerphone, it was me who was grounded. I still remember the way my father stared at me across the kitchen table, his voice a dull hammer. "You should have stopped her." My mouth opened, but no words came. I think I laughed maybe, or cried. It's blurry now. What I do remember, clear as glass, is the silence that followed, and how it felt heavier than anything he could have said. That was the day I realized I could scream and it wouldn't make a difference. They had already cast my role, the obedient one, the buffer, the one who takes the fall so the golden girl can keep flying. I didn't fight it. I folded myself smaller, I kept my lines short, my smile precise. I edited myself for their comfort. Even when I caught him kissing her, the boy who used to leave notes in my locker, the one who asked me what my favorite book was and actually listened, I said nothing. And when he came to me that same night whispering, "You're better, but she's easier," I didn't scream, didn't slap him, didn't cry. I let them write it all. Because somewhere, deep under the ache and the ash, I knew something they didn't. Stories can be edited, and editors come later. That idea, the first flicker of defiance, settled in me like smoke curling beneath a door. I didn't need to win them back. I didn't need their spotlight. I needed time. I needed patience. I needed to wait until the applause died down and the script cracked open wide enough for me to slip inside and rewrite the ending. But for now, I lived in the attic. It wasn't a punishment. It was a choice. Elira had taken the bedroom with the balcony, the vintage wardrobe, the bay window overlooking the garden. I took the slanted ceiling and creaking floorboards above the kitchen, where the heat bloomed in summer and the wind whistled through the vents in winter. I lined the walls with my own books, my journals, my versions of what never got told. Every night, I listened to the buzz of dinner parties below, the clink of wine glasses, Elira's laugh gliding effortlessly through the air like a song. I wrote during those nights, not poetry, nothing that soft, just memories, fractured and sharp like broken glass, pressed into pages only I would read. I recorded what they forgot. The time I covered for Elira's missed math test, the way she once pulled my hair so hard I couldn't sleep on my back for 2 days, the time she told a teacher I cheated on a paper and smiled sweetly when I got detention. Dust settled on the photo frames in the hallway. Only her face was cleaned, polished, admired. Mine faded slowly behind the glare of time and neglect. I stopped brushing past them, stopped hoping they'd notice. I became my own reflection, blurred, half-lit, vanishing in corners. There's something haunting about being invisible in your own home. You start to forget your shape, your voice. I found myself mouthing words instead of saying them, nodding before I was even asked a question. My body learned the choreography of submission. But my mind sharpened. Pain is a strange sculptor. It carves quietly. It chisels without asking. And in that attic, I became something more dangerous than angry. I became patient. There was a mirror at the far end of the room, cracked at the edge from when Elira had slammed the door one summer, and the vibration knocked it off the nail. She never apologized, just laughed and it looked better that way. Abstract. I kept it anyway. Something about that fracture felt honest. I'd stand in front of it sometimes, late at night, staring at my own face like it was a stranger's. Lips too thin, eyes too wide, nothing soft or golden about me. I wasn't the kind of girl boys wrote songs about or mothers bragged about in salons, but I didn't need to be. I wasn't interested in songs or salon praise. I wanted something else. Not a new life, a new ending. One where the forgotten girl doesn't beg to be seen. One where she chooses when to be seen and by whom. "You're responsible," my father had said. And that's when I decided. Silence could be louder than screams. And if no one would hand me the pen, I would steal it and write the kind of story they'd never see coming. The first time I noticed I was missing from the family albums, I told myself it was an accident. One photo, then two, a birthday party where I'd baked the cake but only Elira was in the frame, smiling like she owned the frosting and the fire, a summer trip where my footprints trailed in the sand behind hers, erased by the time the camera shuttered. In one image, Thanksgiving maybe, my hand was visible in the corner, caught mid-reach for a serving spoon. The rest of me? Cropped. Gone. I remember staring at that photo like it was a crime scene, dissecting the edge of my wrist as though I could prove I had existed. But that's how Elira worked. Not with knives, with edits. It was slow, subtle erasure. She rewrote reality the way a spider spins a web, gracefully, invisibly, until you're caught. And by the time I realized I was fading, the story had already moved on without me. I stopped showing up in dinner conversations. I wasn't consulted on vacations or invited to brunches. When distant relatives asked how I was, my mother would chirp, "She's doing well, working on something academic, I think." Meanwhile, Elira was described in Technicolor, her internships, her boyfriends, her highlights, and heartbreaks all recited like scripture. I became background noise. Wallpaper with eyes. And then the accident happened. I wish I could say I felt something the moment the call came, but I didn't. Just static. I was tutoring a student on a Saturday morning when my phone buzzed and the world flattened to one sentence. "There's been a car crash. Your parents didn't make it." Elira did. Of course she did. I arrived at the hospital too late for goodbye, but not too late for the performance. Elira sat in the waiting room, draped in a blanket like some tragic heroine. A thin cut decorated her cheek, just deep enough to photograph well. Her voice trembled in the places it needed to. She didn't cry when she hugged me. She didn't have to. The camera crews were already leaving. The funeral was beautiful. She made sure of that. Everything coordinated. Black lace veil, pale roses, a slideshow of curated memories where I was reduced to a side note. In one photo, our 7th grade recital, my face was blurred out by a lens flare. In another, the family vacation to Prague, Elira stood alone on the Charles Bridge, a scarf fluttering just so, while I held the bags just out of frame. I sat through it all in the second row, silent, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap they turned white. I didn't speak at the funeral. She said I could, but there wasn't time, of course. Not with the tribute video and the eulogy she delivered in a breathless soprano. People wept. They called her brave. I watched her from behind a veil of silence, studying how convincingly she mourned the very people she'd already replaced. The reading of the will came a week later in a lawyer's office that smelled like expensive neglect. I sat in a stiff leather chair while the lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked at me like he'd rather be anywhere else. Elira will retain full ownership of the house, vehicles, and remaining assets, he read, per your parents' final instructions. He slid a manila envelope toward me across the table like a waiter presenting a bill. There's a small box in the attic with some of your father's old journals. They wished for you to have those. No apology, no hesitation, just that bland, professional smile and the quiet thud of dismissal. You understand, I'm sure. I didn't blink, didn't speak. Because what could I say that wouldn't taste like begging? He closed the folder and stood. The meeting was over. I walked home alone. Elira didn't offer a ride. When I unlocked the door, her door now, it already felt like trespassing. The attic box was waiting where he said it would be, dusty, unmarked, smelling faintly of mildew and ink. I carried it to the corner where the light barely reached and set it down beside the cracked mirror. My knees ached as I lowered myself to the floor and opened it. Inside were scraps of thought, unpublished journal entries from my father, observations about weather patterns, politics, and an occasional note about Elira's grades. I wasn't mentioned, not even once, not a birthday, not a memory, not a footnote. The pages blurred through my tears, not the loud, cinematic kind, just a steady leak of salt, like my body had given up on words. I wasn't grieving them, I whispered to the box, to the cracked glass, to no one. I was grieving the version of me they never let live. I didn't cry at the funeral, but that night, I did. Not because I missed them, because I missed what I could have been if they'd ever loved me like she didn't have to earn. I should have left then, should have packed a bag and found a new city, a new name, but I didn't, because something in me refused to vanish entirely, not yet. Elira thought she had inherited everything. She didn't see the attic as anything more than a dusty inconvenience. But I did. I saw it for what it was, an editing room. Where she had played author, I would become the revisionist. I rearranged the boxes, lit candles, taped every picture she'd forgotten to remove from the walls. There weren't many. One from kindergarten, where we both held the same teddy bear. One from a Halloween where she was a princess. And I, clearly unplanned, was a ghost in a bedsheet. Fitting, I thought. I moved the cracked mirror to face the window. Let it reflect the dawn. Let it remind me every morning what they had done and what they hadn't. This wasn't a weakness. It was a strategy. You don't fight a narrative by screaming. You rewrite it, one page at a time. I wasn't ready yet. But I would be. And when I was, the world Elira built would crumble from the inside because I would be the silence between her lines. And silence always echoes louder than applause. Ghosts don't need to be dead, they just have to be forgotten. I wore gray, not by accident, but by ritual. In a town painted with pastel smiles and curated moments, I found invisibility in charcoal knits and faded denim. I wasn't dull, I was strategic. People don't question the wallpaper, they decorate over it. After the funeral, after the will, after Elira's tear-stained press interview about our loving parents, I returned to the attic and folded myself back into silence. But it was a new kind of silence now. Not the empty kind, not defeat. This one had weight. Direction. I needed a job. Not because of money, though the inheritance had been stripped from me like an expired membership, but because I needed proximity, access, information. So I took the one thing Elira and her friends would never lower themselves to do. I tutored their daughters. 5 days a week, I entered glass houses where everything looked perfect until you tilted your head and saw the cracks, the chipped frames hidden behind bookshelves, the daughters who cried silently over math equations because their mothers had told them not to wrinkle their eyeliner, the fathers who forgot birthdays but remembered press conferences. These homes were my field study. Reputation, I learned, always wore designer heels and walked with practiced ease, but every performance has a breaking point, and that point always arrived somewhere in Act 3. I started keeping notes. Not on the children, I helped them honestly, maybe too gently, but on the parents, the families, the scripts they wrote for themselves. I watched the way the mothers performed concern, how they said, "We're just worried," when they meant, "Why aren't you perfect like her?" I cataloged every nervous glance, every frantic cover-up, every photo wall that hid a door they didn't want opened. It was comforting, in a twisted way, seeing how fragile it all was. Even the queens had unsewn seams. And then one morning, it happened. I was organizing my materials in the hallway when I heard the name echo from a television in the next room. Elira. My stomach tightened. Daughter of the late Charles and Helena Marrow, socialite and philanthropist Elira Marrow is set to marry Daniel Corvin, heir to the Corvin development empire. There it was. The next act. Elira always did love a finale with flair. I stood frozen, my pulse ticking against my ribs. Daniel. That name was a locked box I hadn't opened in years. Not since the night after my parents' crash. Not since he came to the attic, face pale, eyes red, voice shaking with things he wasn't ready to admit. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," he'd said back then. "She doesn't love me the way you do." He was wrong. I didn't love him. But I kissed him anyway. Because I knew Elira did. The wedding announcement was everywhere by the afternoon. Gold-tinted engagement photos in glossy magazines. Articles quoting Elira's perfectly choreographed joy. "He's my safe place," she said in one. "My beginning." I closed the article. My fingers didn't tremble. My expression didn't crack. I sat still on the attic floor, tracing the outline of the necklace I kept in the old velvet box, the one Daniel had given me that night. A silver chain with a single flat opal pendant. He said it reminded him of my eyes. He was wrong about that too. My eyes weren't soft, they were mirrors. The invitation came in the mail 3 days later, handmade, embossed, ridiculously expensive. I waited until nightfall before opening it. The paper felt like skin, too delicate to belong to anything real. "You'll be my maid of honor," Elira had written in looping cursive, as if we'd ever shared secrets that didn't have teeth. I said yes, of course. That's what ghosts do. We nod, we drift, we wait. The engagement party was held at the Corvin estate. Marble pillars, gold trim, a violin quartet playing near the champagne tower. I wore slate gray, not black. It wasn't a funeral, not yet. The moment Daniel saw me, his posture changed. He didn't come over, didn't speak, but he saw me. And that was enough. I moved through the party like breath, silent, necessary, unnoticed. I watched Elira command the room, each laugh measured, each compliment deflected just enough to appear humble. Her ring sparkled under the chandeliers. Her lies glinted harder. I sipped ginger ale and pretended to admire the decor, but my mind was slicing through the scene like film reels. I remembered the night Daniel touched my wrist and called it delicate. I remembered how Elira once screamed when she found out he'd texted me at midnight. I remembered the look she gave me, the kind of look reserved for rats in restaurants. She thought she had won, but she had merely hired her own undertaker. I stayed till the end, standing just behind the photographer as they staged the final group picture. Elira pulled Daniel close, their faces lit in artificial joy. He didn't smile, not fully, and when the flash went off, his eyes were looking at me, not her. Afterward, Elira brushed past me, whispering like velvet-wrapped venom. "You're lucky I included you," she murmured. I smiled gently. "I'm always lucky." She didn't notice the necklace. Or maybe she did, but told herself it was just a coincidence. Guilt rewrites memories in softer fonts. That night, I placed the necklace around my neck, let it rest just below my collarbone like a blade hidden beneath silk. Not as a memento, as a bookmark. Because this wasn't the end of the chapter. It was the start of my edit. They never see the ghost until the house burns down. And I'd already struck the first match. The rehearsal dinner smelled like wilted lilies and overcooked ambition. Everything was too polished. Crystal glasses, manicured laughter, even the string quartet humming some forgettable Vivaldi in the corner like a Spotify playlist no one had the heart to pause. Elira floated through it all in ivory silk and borrowed confidence, greeting each guest as if she'd written them into existence. Her smile was sculpted, her voice pitched at the frequency of praise. I arrived 5 minutes late on purpose. Gray dress again, the same one I wore to the engagement party, not out of laziness, but precision. People remember color before they remember faces, and I didn't want them to remember mine. Not yet. The necklace hung just above my collarbone, a small silver opal pendant, nothing flashy, but enough. Subtle enough to be dismissed, familiar enough to haunt. Daniel saw it the moment I stepped into the room. His eyes dropped to my chest, lingered for a fracte. On too long, then snapped back to his champagne flute, his fingers tightened around the stem. He said nothing. Good. The silence meant the memory still lived, unspoken, breathing somewhere behind his ribs like a wound stitched too fast. I let him sit with it. Because I remembered everything. It was the night of the crash, our parents' bodies not yet cold, Elira still shaking from the performance of tears. I had fled to the attic, hoping to dissolve into the insulation and floorboards. But Daniel came instead. Not Elira, not anyone else. He stood in the doorway, dripping with rain and grief, and said, "I didn't know where else to go." He didn't touch me at first, just looked around like the attic was sacred ground, sawdust, shadows and all. He told me he was sorry, that he hated how invisible I'd been made, that he didn't understand why the world bent to Elira when I was the one quietly holding it up. He sat beside me on the warped wooden floor, so close I could hear his breath stumble between words. And then, just before he left, he reached into his coat pocket and handed me the necklace. "She doesn't love me like you do," he said, voice breaking like something final. And I, naive, raw, stupid in the way only grief can make you, kissed him. Not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to be seen, just once, fully, without the filter of Elira's shadow. He kissed back, and then he left. No explanation, no apology, just absence. The next morning, he was back at Elira's side, carrying her coat, kissing her temple, smiling like he hadn't lit a match in the attic the night before. I should have thrown the necklace away. Instead, I tucked it into the bottom of my journal box, buried beneath pages of things I never dared say aloud. But now I wore it like a weapon. Not to win him. To remind him. To watch him squirm in the elegant ruins of his own loyalty. The dinner dragged on. Toasts, laughter. That awful, brittle laughter people use when they're afraid of silence. I barely touched my food, just watched. Elira gave her speech. Perfect posture, tears at the ready. "I never thought I'd find someone who loved me entirely," she said, placing her hand over Daniel's like a branding iron. But then came Daniel. He didn't speak, just smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. Afterward, I found him standing alone on the balcony, fiddling with his cufflink like it had secrets. I stepped beside him, close enough for the pendant to catch the moonlight. He glanced down, froze. His voice was low, taut. "You still have that?" I tilted my head. "Of course." "You shouldn't." "Why?" I asked softly. "You gave it to me." "That was..." He exhaled. "It was a mistake." "Was it?" He didn't answer. I turned to face him fully, letting the night drape around us like velvet. My voice stayed calm, measured. "You said she doesn't love you like I do." He flinched. "And you were right," I added, "because she never had to." The silence stretched so long, I could hear the click of forks on china from inside. "She loves what you represent," I continued. "The name, the influence, the symmetry. You're her accessory, Daniel, just like I was their insurance policy." "Don't," he muttered. "Don't twist this." "I'm not twisting anything." My fingers grazed the opal. "You already broke it. I'm just holding the pieces." He turned away, fingers running through his hair like regret could be pulled out strand by strand. I didn't follow. There was nothing more to say. The trap had already been laid, not in words, but in memories. Let him remember the rain. Let him remember the attic. Let him remember the way guilt curdles when it isn't voiced. I walked back into the golden-lit room, every eye on Elira's laughter, her dress, her carefully arranged joy. No one noticed me passing, not even her. Perfect. They never see the ghost. Until the fire. And I had just handed him the match. I didn't give him the file at night. No, that would have been too expected, too dramatic, too convenient. I chose daylight. Mid-morning, a Tuesday. The kind of hour that makes people feel safe, makes their defenses slow. Vulnerability always wears a sharper edge when cloaked in routine. He met me in a quiet cafe, one Elira would never step into. Too small, too plain. The kind of place where lipstick smudges on ceramic cups weren't a scandal, just human. Daniel walked in wearing tailored gilt and an expression that said he hadn't slept. His jaw looked tighter than usual, his eyes unfocused. Good. He sat across from me without saying hello, his fingers folding into each other like a question he was too proud to ask out loud. I didn't make him wait. From my tote, I pulled a slim black folder. Matte, no labels, simple, quiet. When I slid it across the table, he didn't reach for it immediately, just stared. What is this? His voice was low, brittle. Truth, I said. Or what you need to see before you say, I do. He opened it slowly, like the contents might burn him. They should. The first page was a photo, Elira, mid-laugh, her hand resting on the thigh of a man whose name sat beneath the image in bold print. Congressman Whitmore. Married. 2 children. His scandal had nearly reached the press last fall before it was scrubbed clean. The second page showed texts. Time-stamped. Flirty. Strategic. You'll owe me after the fundraiser. Stop calling when my assistant is there. I need the zoning approved before July. You promised. Each message was a thread unraveling the illusion she sold to the world. This wasn't love. It wasn't even betrayal in the romantic sense. It was worse. It was leverage. She hadn't chosen Daniel because she loved him. She'd chosen him because he was the next step, the pretty prop piece in her future brand. Marrying into the Corvin name would open doors, and the affair with the congressman had paved the hallways. Daniel? He was just the bow on top. I watched as he turned each page with stiff fingers, jaw clenched so tightly I wondered if his molars might crack. I don't believe this, he said finally. You do, I answered, calm. You're just trying not to. His eyes flicked up. Why show me this? Because you deserve to know. He shook his head. Don't play noble. This is revenge. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice to something sharp enough to wound. If I wanted revenge, Daniel, I'd wait until your wedding day. I'd stand beside her in a matching dress and let the world see your face when the foundation she built crumbles under vows. His breath caught. But I'm not here to ruin your life, I said. Just to remind you it's still yours. He closed the folder. Tight, like sealing a wound. The silence between us stretched thin, fragile, like glass warped by heat. I need time, he muttered. I nodded. You have until Saturday. I left before he could say anything else, before he could ask about the necklace, or the kiss, or why I hadn't buried all of this in the same grave as my childhood. Some stories don't need sequels, they need red pens. That night, the clouds began to gather, low and slow, as if the sky itself was swallowing breath. Fitting. Storms always come before endings. My phone rang at 1:14 a.m. Elira, of course. I let it ring twice before answering. Tell me it's not true. Her voice was sharp, jagged. No pretense now, no silken purr. Which part? I asked softly. That you used him? Or that I noticed? You vindictive little... I prefer editor. I'll erase you, she snapped. And there it was. That sentence, that hunger, the fear tucked inside fury. I'll erase you. I could almost see her in that moment, barefoot in her expensive kitchen, one heel off, mascara streaked just enough to ruin the illusion, hair undone, control slipping. I didn't raise my voice. You already did, I said. I'm just returning the favor. She hung up. No threats, no tears. Just a click. The kind of silence that told me she'd started to believe I was capable of far more than she'd ever imagined. I stood at the attic window and watched the first lightning thread across the horizon. The clouds were thick, charcoal and coiled, swollen with the weight of something final. I didn't smile. This wasn't joy. This was inevitable. They say weddings are about love, but they're really about stories. Ones people tell themselves, ones families want to believe, ones that look good in photos. Elira had built hers in gold leaf and filtered light, but gold flakes, and filters crack. Saturday was coming, and I had just rewritten the final scene. Weddings are stories in white. They wrap themselves in silk and florals and pretend they've always been pure. But every story, no matter how carefully rehearsed, will always reveal its seams when stretched too tightly. That morning, the sky was the color of old bone, pale, hushed, and waiting. It didn't storm. That would have been too poetic. Too obvious. No, the clouds just hovered, heavy and swollen, like the sky itself was holding its breath. The cathedral gleamed like a set piece, all marble, arches and gold inlays, with light that poured through stained glass like confession. The guests arrived in flocks, women in pearls, men in pressed suits, their mouths full of compliments and camera-ready awe. They smiled because they were told to. Elira stood at the center of it all, a vision in lace and illusion. Her dress shimmered faintly as she moved, each step precise, like she was floating down a runway. She was breathtaking, I'll give her that. Artfully undone curls pinned just so, veil cascading behind her like a prayer answered in silk. Her smile was carved into place, glossy and proud. She looked like a bride. She looked like she had won. I stood behind her in a slate-gray dress, holding the train of her gown like a dutiful shadow. No one looked at me. That was the point. My hands were steady, my mind even steadier. She turned toward me briefly as we waited for the music cue, and I leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "They all believe you," I said. She blinked. "For now." Her breath hitched, just once. That was all I needed. She turned away, laugh bubbling up like nothing had happened. She knew how to perform, I'd give her that. But even the best actresses have one moment when the mask shifts. The doors opened. The music swelled. The procession began. I walked behind her, carrying her illusion like a silk offering, heart calm and pacing with precision. I didn't feel anger, not anymore, just a quiet detachment, the kind surgeons must feel before they cut. As we reached the altar, Daniel stood waiting. He looked sharp, polished, distant. His smile was a shade too tight, his hands folded just a little too carefully in front of him, like he was holding something back. Good. The ceremony unfolded as expected. Words, vows, applause, all played like a script none of them realized had already been rewritten. The guests were seated, smiling into programs, mouthing along with lines they'd heard 100 times in other weddings, in other lives. And beneath every chair, tucked in gold-sealed envelopes, was a story they hadn't rehearsed. Printed on high-grade paper, clear, undeniable. Every message Elira had sent to Congressman Whitmore, every timestamp, every glimpse behind her curated curtain, no commentary, just truth. Cold and quiet, waiting to be unwrapped. The priest began the vows. Elira's voice trembled, not with emotion, but with precision. She had practiced that tremble. I'd seen it once in the mirror, years ago, when I still thought mimicking her might make me lovable. She turned to Daniel, eyes glistening with the kind of tears you can summon on command. And then, he hesitated, just a second too long, not enough to ruin anything. Just enough to stain it. That beat, a blink of hesitation, a pause in breath, rippled through the front row like a crack beneath glass. A few heads tilted, a few brows furrowed, but the moment passed and the priest continued. Daniel spoke his lines. He kissed her. Applause erupted like clockwork. But the moment the clapping began, the envelopes began to open. The sound was subtle at first. Soft tears of paper, the rustle of surprise. Then gasps, then silence. One by one, faces changed. Mouths fell slightly open. Eyes flicked between pages and altar. A woman in the third row dropped her program. A man in the front row lowered his phone mid-recording, screen still glowing. The bride turned to beam at the crowd and met a wall of confusion. And then, finally, her gaze fell on me. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I stood still as stone. Unreadable. She blinked once, twice, like the world had suddenly tilted. Bika. Use, it had. I watched her realize, live in real time, that the applause was hollow, that the admiration was collapsing, that every carefully sewn thread was pulling loose. Because betrayal doesn't have to be screamed, it just has to be seen. And today, everyone saw her. For what she was. She took a small step back, the hem of her dress catching on the corner of the altar. Daniel turned to her, confusion bleeding into panic. "What is this?" he asked, voice low, jaw tightening. But she didn't answer. She couldn't. Because no one had ever written her a scene where she didn't know what to say. And I, still holding her veil, whispered into the air. I didn't need to scream. I just needed to make sure they stopped clapping. And they had. One by one. The spell had broken. The show was over. And all that was left, it was the truth. The house was too quiet when I returned, not the kind of quiet that soothes. No, this one rang hollow, like the inside of a broken bell. The laughter was gone, the scent of roses had faded to something sour, and the lights, always on for appearances, had been left off. Shadows clung to the corners like bruises. I didn't need to ask how the reception went. I already knew. By the time I left the cathedral, the group photos had been canceled. The DJ never played the first dance. A few guests slipped out quietly while others lingered, watching Elira crumble beneath a storm of whispered confrontations and widened eyes. The wedding coordinator tried to keep order, but you can't manage a narrative once the truths escaped its packaging. Elira, radiant just hours ago, had pulled Daniel aside in a flurry of tulle and denial. I saw them from the far end of the corridor, her voice rising like panic, his arms crossed like a door he'd already closed. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse me. He just stood still. And silence has always been the deadliest answer. I didn't linger to see the aftermath. That story no longer belonged to me. What I wanted now was something quieter. Not vengeance. Clarity. So I went home, to the attic. One last time. The stairs creaked under my feet like they remembered. The air still smelled of old paper and lavender I'd tucked into the corners last fall. The journals I'd filled were stacked neatly in a crate beside the bed, each one labeled not by date, but by phase. Erosion, eclipse, embers. I crossed the room, heart steady, hands loose at my sides, and sat in front of the cracked mirror, the one Elira shattered when we were 12. She had thrown a shoe at it after a fight, yelling that it made her look weird when we stood side by side. We had the same eyes. But mine asked harder questions. The fracture still ran down the center, cleaving our childhood reflecte. Ons in two. I used to think it ruined the mirror. Now I think it revealed it. I stared at myself. Older now, sharper around the eyes, the softness chipped away by years of being passed over. Was it enough? The question hung in the air like steam over still water. Not angry, not triumphant, just honest. I traced the edge of the mirror with my finger, watching the light bend and split across my face. The image that stared back didn't look victorious. It looked free. And that, I realized, was something Elira would never be. Even if she managed to repair the damage, spin the betrayal into another curated tragedy, cry into the right microphones, smile with practiced heartbreak, she'd never breathe easy again. Because once a story has been questioned, it never holds the same weight. Once an audience sees the trick, the magic is dead. They might still applaud, but they'll never believe it. She would spend the rest of her life haunted by the memory of those envelopes, the flicker of shame in Daniel's eyes, the sting of my words whispered behind her veil. And I would leave it behind. Not to start over, but to start true. I glanced down at the suitcase beside me, half full, a single pair of worn jeans, 3 books, 1 pen, the necklace coiled like a quiet question in a velvet pouch. No dress, no photos, no memories I didn't choose. I didn't need to take much. I had never been given much. But I had carved something out of that scarcity, something sharp, something honest, something mine. The attic had been my cocoon, my tomb, my chapel. It held every draft of the girl I had tried to become, the obedient daughter, the forgivable sister, the forgotten one who asked for nothing and got exactly that. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was the ghost who stayed long enough to haunt the ending, and now I was the woman who would leave before the next chapter began. Because I didn't want her life. I never did. Not the dresses or the headlines or the hollow praise. I wanted authorship. I wanted the power to write myself into something that didn't require a spotlight to matter. Something real. Outside, thunder rumbled, not loud but deep, like a warning beneath the earth. Rain hadn't come yet, but it would. It always did after something scorched. I stood, suitcase in hand, and took one last look at the mirror. My reflection watched me back. No fracture between us now. Just a woman, whole in her silence. The house creaked again behind me, floorboards sighing, walls remembering. Let them. Let it all remember. Because I wouldn't. I was done rehearsing grief. Tomorrow, I'd leave this town behind. Let her rebuild her ruins. Let her spin what she could from the ashes. Let her talk about betrayal, about being blindsided, about the cruelty of sisters and shadows. She could tell whatever story she liked. This time, I wouldn't be in it. Because I was no longer a ghost. I was the editor. And the next line would be mine. I left the house key on her windowsill. No note, no goodbye. Just the thin, rusted shape of something that had never truly belonged to me, set quietly beneath the bloomless hydrangeas she'd planted for the press. I didn't need her to see me walk away. That wasn't the point. The point was this. I had nothing left to carry but my own name. The sky was still dark when I stepped onto the street, suitcase rolling behind me like an echo that finally had the decency to keep quiet. The pavement glittered with last night's mist, and my breath came in small, visible clouds, each one a tiny, vanishing act. The town slept behind drawn curtains and alarm systems, still wrapped in curated comfort. Elira's scandal hadn't reached every doorstep yet, but it would. Truth doesn't need a microphone. It only needs time. I passed the bakery where she used to buy cinnamon rolls just for the Instagram shot. The bookshop where they never stocked anything I read. The park bench where I once sat in the rain after my mother forgot to pick me up. Every corner I'd ever been erased from suddenly looked smaller, faded, like a painted backdrop in a play I'd already closed. At the station, the bench was cold but clean. The bus wasn't there yet, just a line of cracked yellow paint and the silence of choices not yet made. I sat and watched the town. It was odd. How quiet liberation felt. No rush of adrenaline, no cinematic swell of triumph, just stillness, just the soft, unfamiliar weight of space, finally mine. I thought I'd feel victorious. I didn't. I felt clear. I didn't need applause. I didn't need her to cry or collapse or beg for forgiveness. I had seen the truth, that revenge doesn't fix you. It frees you from needing to be fixed. For years, I wanted to be chosen. I wanted someone, anyone, to look at me and say, "You matter more than her." I wasted whole seasons of my life whispering worth into people who had already decided I was optional. But the real shift didn't come when I exposed Elira. It came when I realized I didn't want her place. I wanted to burn the whole script and write something else, something that didn't depend on being seen. The bus pulled up, headlights dimmed, engine purring like it already knew I wouldn't turn back. The driver opened the door without a word. I climbed the steps slowly, one hand on the rail, one on my suitcase handle, and chose the window seat in the third row. I liked that spot. Not too close to the driver, not too far from the door, just close enough to leave fast if I had to. As the engine rumbled to life, I turned toward the glass and watched the town blur. The streets bled into each other, the houses folded into shadow. The entire curated illusion that had shaped me disappeared in reverse, like a film being unwound frame by frame. I could almost hear the voiceover. She lived here once, but she was always just visiting. I closed my eyes and thought of the cracked mirror. The attic. The journals. The quiet way I once tried to earn love like a wage I hadn't worked hard enough to deserve. Let them keep their story. I didn't want it. And if it ever found me again, if it tried to write me back in, pull me into the wings to play the supporting role, the scapegoat, the convenient casualty, let it. I still have the matches. I opened my eyes and exhaled. The road stretched ahead like a clean page. Not a new life, a new ending. No more contorting to fit someone else's narrative. No more shrinking, apologizing, waiting for permission to matter. The world was vast and terrifying and unfinished. And that was the point. That was the power. I didn't know where I was going yet. Maybe somewhere quiet, maybe somewhere loud, maybe somewhere no one had heard of Elira Marrow, or her sister, or the girl who once disappeared into wallpaper just to keep the peace. But wherever it was, would arrive whole. Because I wasn't the main character in their story anymore. I was something more dangerous. An editor who decided the ending wasn't good enough. And this? This was the rewrite. The bus rolled forward, and the first rays of morning cracked over the horizon, gray, pink, and full of promise. Not golden, not clean, but real. The kind of light that doesn't hide the mess. The kind of light that lets you see what's worth saving. I looked ahead, unblinking. Ready. The old story was behind me now, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the blank page. Sometimes, freedom doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from choosing yourself, even when no one else ever did. This story reminds us that we are not bound by the scripts we were born into. We can be editors, we can be architects, we can walk away from applause that was never meant for us and write something truer. So now it's your turn. Have you ever felt erased from your own story? What would you rewrite if no one could stop you? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this story cracked something open inside you, hit like, tap subscribe, and come back for the next chapter in reclaiming your voice.